I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about an incredible new book by the New York Times global economics correspondent, Peter S. Goodman, his brand new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. I mean, this is an issue that we're talking about a lot at CSIS, a lot on the Trade Guys podcast, but I wanted to have Peter to myself and not have the Trade Guys try to hog and talk about all their, nonsense. So, but Peter, this is an open invitation to come on Trade Guys anytime. So we're going to bring you back.
I'm up for it. Anytime you like.
This is a really fascinating book, but I want to ask a really simple question. I'm not going to get like all economic, all policy on you yet. I'm going to get into that, but how did the world run out of everything?
Well, basically, we overwhelmed the works of what we can call the supply chain with demand. I think, misconstrued what would happen when the pandemic hit. People who forecast for a living, who work for companies who have to figure out what's the demand going to be, what's the supply going to be, and they provision accordingly. They figured, okay, we've got these quarantines, people are staying at home, companies are going to be disrupted, so we're going to need a lot less of just about everything. We should stop ordering computer chips because there's going to be less demand for computers and cars and just about everything. And that was a colossal miscalculation. Of course, what we learned is if you can't go to the gym, you buy an exercise bike and you put it in your basement. Can't go to a restaurant, you'll just try to entertain your family with lots of baking projects and you'll buy new kitchen appliances. Your kids aren't going to school, but you still have to deal with them. In fact, you have to deal with them more than ever. I guess we'll put a trampoline in the backyard if we're lucky enough to have one. We'll buy them a new iPad, video game console. So a lot of this stuff is made in Chinese factories and Asian factories in general, and it has to end up on container ships. And the shipping industry itself anticipated this downturn and said, well, there's going to be less demand for our ships. We're actually going to park a bunch of them in warm waters in places like Greece, and we'll wait for demand to come back. So when the global economy figures out, oh, whoops, actually, we need a lot more of certain things, we immediately have shortages, computer chips being the most obvious, and this affects production of smartphones. Cars become very hard to buy. Really important things like medical devices, ventilators. I mean, computer chips are basically the brains of the modern economy. And then once stuff starts to get made again, at first, we don't have enough labor in key places like China because there are quarantines on and off for COVID. People are sick at American docks, at ports. You don't have enough dock workers. Warehouse workers are sick and things are disrupted there. Truck drivers are falling prey to COVID. And then you just have so much stuff showing up at once. You got these containers stacked up like, Legos for giants, at every port. They run out of places to put them. And so I think this part people probably remember, and this is where my book starts. At the height of it, you have 50, 60, 70 giant container vessels floating for weeks at a time off of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. These two ports are the gateway for 40% of all imported goods that enter the United States by container. And they're just sitting there waiting for their chance to load and unload at the dock. By some estimates, you have $1 trillion worth of product floating off ports around the world in this fashion. And that's all stuff that's supposed to be somewhere else.
And so this is when, during the pandemic, immediately after the pandemic, even now, all we hear is people complaining about supply chain. I can't get anything because they tell me the supply chain, my new desk or my new kitchen table is sitting on one of these ships and it can't get into port. Is that still going on, or is there an engineered scarcity going on?
Well, there's both of those things, and I'm glad you're asking about engineered scarcity because monopoly power is certainly a subject that I spend a lot of time on in the book and that we ought to talk about. The punchline, it's not a very funny punchline to many of the chapters in the book, is that when there's a shock to the system, things get scarce. Suddenly it's hard to find beef. You can't find exercise gear. You can't find this particular appliance or this auto part or the cabinet that you're waiting to put into the kitchen you're redoing. And behind a lot of those stories is pricing power and monopoly power. And the punchline part is that after all this disruption, companies are celebrating record profits. But a lot of these problems have gotten less, but there are new shocks to the system. So we're still out of things like doorknobs, meters, just to pick one at random, that electrical companies use and this is a key reason, by the way, that we can't build enough housing. I did this story recently in Phoenix on the lack of affordable housing. And part of the problem and why it's so severe is that it's difficult to build stuff. And that's in part because these supply chains are still a problem. We don't, for the most part, have these floating queues off of ports. That's all worked its way around. But we've got new things to worry about. We've got Houthi rebels firing at container ships entering the Suez Canal in solidarity with Palestinians under assault in Gaza. That's causing container ships that are en route from Asia to Europe, instead of going through the Suez, which is really a major waterway, to go the long way around Africa. That adds weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in cost. So you've got delays. And every time a container ship shows up late, somebody's waiting for the stuff that's on that ship and they can't make their product. You're a paint manufacturer in Wilmington, Delaware, and you've got all the ingredients that you need to make your paint, but there's one that can't make it to you from Asia. Well, you're stuck waiting. I tell the story in the book of how Henry Ford would be spinning in his grave. He was a guy who was, really obsessed with supply chains and self-sufficiency. And I'm walking the catwalk in early 2022 at the River Rouge plant outside of Detroit, where they're making Ford's most popular vehicle, the F-150 pickup truck. And they're making the entire vehicle, except you can't drive it because they can't get any computer chips. And they're parking these mostly finished vehicles in the shadow of Ford's corporate headquarters across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School. So these problems are still with us, and they move around a lot.
Have the computer chips become more resilient along the supply chain? During the pandemic and right after the pandemic, nobody could buy a car because these computer chips were not exactly what you just said. People were selling used cars for new car prices. Has this stabilized at all?
Yeah, that's eased a lot. It's still a problem in some markets. I tell the story of a guy who needed a medical device for sleep apnea, who was waiting for 6 months. He eventually did get his machine, but for 6 months, he's going to sleep wondering, am I going to make it? And I interviewed the CEO of this company that's based in San Diego, who was begging the chip manufacturers in Taiwan to prioritize him. He said, listen, we're hearing it from the auto companies who think they should be prioritized. And our biggest customers are Apple and Google, and they're not getting enough. And then, the deeper you go into the supply chain, the more complex it gets. It turns out that the chip manufacturer in Taiwan was waiting for one process that depended upon one chemical that it couldn't get out of China. So he's talking to some guy in Dubai who's talking to one of his suppliers in Australia who figures out that another factory in Taiwan can't get this chemical from China. So they're all wait. The story of the supply chain is it's not like some wizards went up to the top of a mountain and designed it and thought about it in this deliberative way. We've got these kind of jury-rigged ad hoc systems that have mostly been built on the fly, heavy dose of shareholder interest coloring everything that we do. And so nobody's really in charge of it. There's no czar of the supply chain. No one fully understands it. It's a little bit like discovering, after the 2008 financial crisis, that like a lot of people thought somebody else was worrying about the thing that maybe we should have worried about, but no one actually understood it.
So now in government, who is worried about this?
A lot of people are worried about different parts of it. So, the Biden administration got very animated around monopoly power, especially on beef. There was talk, this is at a time during the worst of the pandemic where people are going to the store and discovering that there's no ground beef on the shelves. I can't feed my kid hamburger. I can't get steak. But meanwhile, cattle ranchers are going out of business because they can't find anybody to buy their animals. And at the center of this are these giant integrated companies, the meat packers, who have market share that would make the robber barons blush. Four companies have an 85% hold on the meatpacking industry. And they've gamed the system so that they can manipulate the supply to keep it tight. So every time it is tight because of a shock, that's an opportunity to jack up the prices. So you both have record high prices for beef and extreme shortages. And yet, slaughterhouse workers, I tell the story of a immigrant from Myanmar who actually dies in a slaughterhouse in Greeley, Colorado, because of an executive order implemented by the Trump administration, which adopts industry talking points that, we got to keep this thing going, or, people are not going to be fed. The American dinner plate is waiting for us. And so unfortunately, these workers they're just indispensable. They've got to keep going.
So
Well, it turns out
she died from COVID.
she dies from
Yeah.
COVID. I'm hearing this story told by her daughter, who had survived with her in this refugee camp in Thailand. They'd set up lives in the States, arriving not speaking any English. The mom had gotten this job. And as the daughter's telling me this story, she's holding her 20-month-old infant who's looking at a picture of the grandmother he's never going to meet. And it turns out that the meat packers are sitting on record volumes of frozen product. They're boosting their exports to places like China, and they just flat out lied about the need to feed Americans while really they're sacrificing slaughterhouse workers for the sake of fattening their profit margins. So monopoly power is definitely part of this explanation too.
One of the things I love about this book, Peter, is you go out and you spend time with real people like the one you just mentioned. What were some of the other adventures you had on this journey that really stood out to you?
I spent 3 days in a long haul truck from Kansas City to Dallas and back
I'm
in the
so glad
middle.
you said that because that was my favorite anecdote by far.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah. It was it was a real eye opener. Driving a truck has always been a hard job, but it used to pay really well. And now it doesn't pay so well, and it's still a really hard job. I mean, if you wanted to simulate it, drive around worrying about parking every second for a day while trying to figure out how you're going to caffeinate enough that you're not going to fall asleep at the wheel. I mean, as the guy who I rode with, Stephen Graves, put it to me, he said, if you're not scared up here, you're just a fool. These trucks require, more than the length of a football field to stop. So you're constantly wanting to think about how aware am I? You're behind the wheel for 8, 10, 12 hours a day sometimes. But every time you stop, you don't know where you're going to park. And every time you have to use the restroom, you have to park and it slows you down. So they're just tortured by these sorts of thoughts. I remember stopping at this truck stop that happened to have a parking space, but it was in the middle of nowhere, this little town in Oklahoma. And Stephen Graves goes in and looks at what's going to be for dinner, and there are these chicken wings that look like they've been sitting there like since the Pleistocene era. No go there. So he grabs, a shrink wrapped turkey sandwich on white bread and two Pop Tarts. And we're walking back in minus 14 across the cracked pavement. And he says, yeah, two Pop Tarts, one for dessert, one for breakfast. I
Oh,
mean, that's the life that these guys are living.
yeah. How is this affecting the rest of us? I mean, we hear all the time about, prices are still high. The economy's good, but prices are still high. It's a campaign issue. It's an election issue. It's an everyday issue for Americans who are really trying just to put food on the table, trying to make ends meet. Why are prices still so high if we've straightened some of this out?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, inflation has a lot of different components, but supply chain is part of it. I mean, I think companies have gotten very good at jacking up their prices, especially in markets where there's less competition, and just blaming it on supply chain, right? Because we're aware of this. I mean, here's this term. Boy, if I had come home, 3 years ago and said to my family, "Oh, I'm working on something on the supply chain," they would have tuned me out quick. Now I've got complete strangers, oh, you know about the supply chain? Tell me about that. I don't understand. How come we couldn't get hand sanitizer? How come I couldn't even get the ingredients to make hand sanitizer in the middle of the pandemic?
You're hot stuff now. There's no question. Everybody wants to know about this.
It's very strange. Yeah, this is a moment for the geeks, but like we're all geeks now because we're all, falling prey to this. And companies have figured this out that we are much more willing to understand in the same way that we're willing to hear that, well, you can get this car if you want, but you're going to pay list or even more than list, to which we say, okay, how quickly can I sign? Because I'm afraid there won't be another car. Well, that's a ka-ching moment for companies. And if you know that you can jack up prices and find that the customer will not be furious with you, you're going to do it. So it's much harder, to say nothing of the fact that our basic monetary policy instrument isn't built for a supply chain crisis. And, never mind the fact that monetary policy doesn't also seem to be built for thinking about what happens when you jack up people's borrowing costs, which makes people very unhappy if you have a mortgage or
Very
credit
unhappy.
card balance. Yeah, there's a lot going on in terms of inflation, but certainly some of it is supply chain and some of it is monopoly power. So it is engineered scarcity.
So tell me about that. The engineered scarcity is a term that we're going to be talking a lot about now and into the future. People, don't understand why companies are using this excuse. Oh, well, the pandemic still, or the supply chain still, when things have cleared up a little bit. And sure, there's inflation, but shouldn't they be able to help mitigate? I know companies are in business to make money. We are capitalists after all, and they're in business to make sure their shareholders are happy. But what about the consumers that are really suffering?
It's a really serious problem. I mean, if you go around the country, I've spent a lot of this year actually going to battleground states to do economic profiles, and from Georgia to Arizona to Nevada to Michigan. I mean, it's very clear that unprompted, if you just start chatting with people, the high cost of living is on people's minds. And there's a vague understanding that the supply chain has something to do with it. But competition policy is something that, specialist economists think about. I think part of the problem is that even some of our most skilled, most thoughtful economists are so steeped. And I'll throw this on my own profession as well. We're so quick to go to supply demand explanations for everything because that's the classical model that we're all exposed to. And obviously, supply and demand does have a lot to say about economics and pricing and what's happening. But companies are sophisticated, and when they manage to build up some dominance in markets, that can be a hard thing to define. That can be a hard thing to understand, but we know it when we see it. And it's just obvious that if we've got a situation where two rail companies are the only choice for rail transportation in most of the United States, and in some places it's only one. It does not take a PhD in economics to understand that they're going to jack up the prices. And, talk about engineered scarcity. I mean, I write at some length about precision scheduled railroading, which is really a fancy term for let's lay off a lot of people who used to work on the railroad. Let's limit schedules. Let's make the trains much longer, which makes things much more complicated. And that will take capacity out of the system and make prices go up. And, that was great for shareholders. It made railroads darlings of Wall Street for a while. And in the middle of the pandemic, I mean, here's a story that really stays with me that I got from the book. I found this engineer in Idaho for Union Pacific who was horrified to discover that he was actually pulling a train loaded with cars going in the wrong direction because precision scheduled railroading is all about, okay, investor class, we're going to cater to success on the metrics that you love. And one of the metrics that Wall Street really loved to assess the efficiency, I mean, there's a word that gets abused a lot, efficiency. One measure is dwell time. How much time does a given container sit in a given lot? So Union Pacific basically sent the word out. We got to do better on dwell time above all else. Nothing else matters. So some guy running a rail yard in Nebraska says, these cars are sitting here. They're getting on the next train wherever it's going. I mean, imagine that, airlines ran this way. Well, you show up, at National Airport or LaGuardia or wherever. Next plane's going to Des Moines. Don't care that you're going to Houston. You're on that plane because we got to limit the dwell time. We got to get you out. I think some people would be unhappy about that.
Very unhappy, specifically at those two airports you just mentioned. I mean, does this also explain why, we can't get on the Excella to New York from DC without paying a fortune at this point?
I'd be in over my head to take a whack at passenger train travel, which is something I haven't really looked at. But I mean, clearly we don't have competition there. I mean, that's that's the model, right?
Yeah,
So
the
we just
competition is the Van Moose bus that leaves out of Bethesda. That's about that's
yeah,
about
good
it.
luck explaining to your relatives if anything happens when you're on that bus.
Oh yeah, no kidding. My goodness. Well, let me also ask you this, and this is something we're looking at really closely at CSIS, that the notion that supply chain, that economic competition really is national security now. Is that something you think about a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I thought about for the book for sure. But I guess I distinguish, and I worry that policymakers are not necessarily distinguishing enough between this question of stuff that clearly has national security implications, like chips and chip making capability. I mean, I don't think you have to think about it hard to realize that concentrating most of your chip production on an island that's 90 miles off the coast of a country that claims that island for itself and that you've decided to have a trade war with, and then increasingly feels like a Cold War, that's not a great idea, right? So common sense says figure out how to get chips built other places. And that's what the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration has given us is designed to do. And you can argue about how the subsidies are targeted and whether they change the market or not, and what happens to the rules-based trading system. And there are all sorts of legitimate conversations to have around that. But this fundamental notion that we ought to think about ways to diversify away from exclusive reliance on that one island, sure. I think when you get into issues that involve climate change, I think there's much more ground for argument, right? So I think reasonable people can disagree about whether it's a good idea to embrace industrial policy for electric vehicles and solar panels, these things that are hugely expensive. It's fair to say I'm not as sympathetic to this idea that this is the destruction of the rules-based trading system because, the climate's not going to wait around for that. Like either we're going to get this stuff made or not. But I do think the pandemic has shown us that it is a bad idea to count on one country on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, a country that we're having hostilities with, to produce, personal protective gear, right? I mean, we all woke up and discovered, oh, we can't make ventilators without parts from China. We've got frontline medical workers going into hospitals to deal with COVID patients without masks because they all come from China. China's prioritizing them for its own use. China's own production is shut down. So, we should be thinking about resilience in a national security way. But I think when national security gets thrown around, I think what we're really saying is we need to contain China.
Right, right. And that's what we talk about all the time is that this national security discussion is really about the US economic competition with China.
Yes. And I think we should be concerned about that. I'm not dismissive of the fact that there are a lot of legitimate beefs with China over trade. But I think the way in which we've come to talk about China is very unhelpful, is sort of increasing the currency of demonization of the other in both countries. And, one of the stories I try to tell in the book is, how China's WTO entry in 2001 watershed moment, opens up marketplaces around the globe. China was already an export powerhouse, but it went to a whole new level, grew exponentially. And now, given that this is one of the few things we seem to agree on both sides of the aisle in the United States,
The only bipartisan thing is that neither party likes China very much.
that's right. And we tend to discuss China like it's, China itself is just a term for this nefarious plot. It's this, giant conspiracy intent on destroying our livelihood and downgrading us below middle class standards. And we forget a bunch of things. Like, first of all, we ended up bringing China into WTO in large part because American companies and Western companies in general lobbied heavily because they wanted to crack at what was the world's largest potential consumer market for just about everything. And they wanted to lower their costs, and nothing looked better than Chinese industry. I mean, the ultimate joint venture in global capitalism is that between the People's Republic of China, an institution, that comes out of this peasant-led revolution, and Walmart, from the citadel of capitalism. And Walmart goes there because it's stable. They don't have to worry about elections. They know what the exchange rate's going to be. They can get access to land and natural resources as long as they cut local party officials in on deals. And the party has done a really good job of investing in things that Walmart wants: infrastructure, highways, ports, electrical capacity. And by the way, this has been a net positive for the vast majority of Americans. We've gotten lower cost goods. We've gotten consumer choice. Our own services has grown. Our own exports, while there are a lot of problems there that ought to be discussed, not dismissed, we have seen economic growth because of our engagement with China. Where we have failed is we have not cushioned the inevitable losers in trade. And that's home cooking. That's not Beijing. That's us. That's decisions made in Congress, in boardrooms, in New York, in Seattle. Our failure to take the gains of globalization and international trade, distribute them more widely, and then fund things like trade adjustment assistance to help the China shock was real. David Autor at MIT and his colleagues did tremendous work in showing that in decade plus after China enters WTO, we lose about 1 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. We lose something like 2 million jobs if you throw in truck drivers, catering companies no longer making food for the factory that used to be down the road. That's all real. But that happens in other countries too. What's perverse about the United States is the people lose their jobs. They have no health care because we have no national health care. We have meager unemployment benefits. We have basically no effective job training. So we abandoned these people and left them to their own devices. And along come political opportunists who just peg the whole thing on China. And the last thing I'll say about this is this using Chinese labor to do the bidding of the investor class is not a new story. I mean, I tell the story of go all the way back to the creation of the railroads in the US, where for the development of the railroads, dangerous work, tough work, involves camping out in the freezing cold, miles from towns. Irish labor chafes. They say, we don't want to do these jobs. They start to mobilize. The railroads literally hire recruitment agencies in China who find Chinese workers and bring them to the United States. And when a lot of people die, they ship their bones in boxes back across the Pacific. I mean, this is something that is part of our history too. So there's a lot to talk about with China, not dismissing that there are real issues in the trading relationship, but this whole sort of moralistic, we're the good guys, they're the evil guys. This is not only wrong, it's not helping us solve our problems.
So when Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and others in the Biden administration talk about our relationship with China and how, these are national security issues, what is it that they really mean?
I think some of what they mean is common sense economics. Like we have to think about place again, which is something that I get into in the book. We have, because of the miracle of the shipping container, and I tell the story of the shipping container as well, because of the internet, because of the rise of giant ports and trade deals like China entering WTO, we've been invited to pretend that a factory down the street is the same as a factory on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And that has caused us some problems, and we need to think about that. But I also think that this use of national security is, not very masked code for China's our enemy and we have to contain China, which is it's this kind of zero sum thinking that is unhelpful.
What about things, Biden administration initiatives like Made in America? That seems really promising. What's behind all that, and where do you think that's headed?
I think it's promising. I mean, I think the danger, of course, is it's now given license to European companies who've been dying to do exactly the same thing and have been told that that violates international trading norms, to go and do all that. So we're now in a situation where national imperatives could potentially trump economic imperatives, which will add cost. But, I will say that we should be careful when someone comes along and says, well, that's going to jack up costs, so therefore we should resist it. Because if there's one thing my book really tries to do, it's reveal that there are costs that go against chasing low costs at all costs. And if you run out of ventilators in the midst of a pandemic, you don't get to say like, yeah, but this was great for a while and our share price is really high. You got a
Right.
problem. And if you run out of computer chips and you can't power medical devices anytime, that's a serious problem. If you forget about competition policy, you forget about antitrust, and parents literally cannot find infant formula for months, there's a huge cost to that. And we're paying the cost now. I mean, even if you're just interested in the lowest cost, we're paying higher costs now. That's what inflation is. That's a result of the supply chain breaking down. So I think Sullivan is right in putting the focus on we got to think about a more expanded form of efficiency And it's not just national security, it's like the social interest, it's the public interest. And that's not just like, well, be nice to workers because that sounds nice. It turns out that if you don't make work a rewarding and fulfilling proposition for large numbers of people you're counting on to do the work. I talked about riding along with the truck driver. I also talked to traveling rail maintenance workers, who have no paid sick leave. I already told you the story of this immigrant who was working at a slaughterhouse who loses her life to keep the gears turning. If we don't make work more rewarding and reliable, then every time there's a shock, we're going to discover that people are going to find something else to do. And just to jump back to Henry Ford, I mean, he specifically said this is a guy who doubled the wages of workers in the 19 teens, was branded a communist by some other business people who said you're going to destroy our competitiveness. And he said, look, I just want to make my products cheaply. I want to make them at scale. And it has to be reliable. And I've come to understand that any business that's built on low wages is inherently unstable. And that's part of our reality.
So I want to talk a little bit about your predictions for the future of the global supply chain. What do you think?
I think that there's sort of a jump ball right now. You know, Economists will tell you that the data doesn't show much change. China's still the center of the manufacturing universe. We've seen some increase in exports from Mexico, but there's a debate about how much of that is based on foreign exchange movements. Some of that is Chinese companies that are adeptly shifting stuff to places like Mexico, places like Vietnam to do final assembly to avoid tariffs on their exports to the United States. Clearly, some of that is going on, but I think this is a place where data is backward looking and journalism is forward looking. And I can tell you from my experience of reporting this book, I spent a lot of time in places like Mexico where I ran into people I did not expect. I mean, I ran into a guy with a South Korean company that makes industrial parts that it sells to John Deere, the tractor and construction manufacturing company. John Deere has a factory in South Texas. And I said to this Korean guy, why are you here in Nuevo Leon, Mexico, just south of the border? He said, well, Deere essentially said, if you want our business, given what we lived through with the shipping crisis, difficulty getting our goods onto container ships, they've said, you've got to be within a 5-hour drive or rail ride from our factory in Victoria, Texas, or we're going to find local suppliers. I ran into a Chinese company, Li Zhong Wheel. They make wheels that they sell to General Motors and Ford. Same story. If you want to sell to our plants in North America, you've got to set up somewhere in North America. So they were setting up a factory in just outside of Monterrey, Mexico, in this big industrial park with 27 other Chinese companies. I spent a couple days with Columbia Sportswear, this iconic sportswear brand headquartered just outside of Portland, Oregon, where the CEO had said to me, we used to assume that container shipping was just basically free and reliable. We don't feel that way anymore. So they were in Guatemala, and I went with them looking at potential factories to get closer to their home market, the United States. So my prediction is we'll see more and more of that. Oh, and I was just in India for 2 weeks visiting factories that are making stuff for Walmart. Walmart's got a target of boosting their sourcing from India to $10 billion by 2027 as they're diversifying away from heavy dependence on China. No one's abandoning China. China still stands alone. The value proposition of huge workforce, even more expensive, highly efficient, good infrastructure. Nobody's walking away, but there is a real sense that there's value in moving production closer to big markets. So for European companies, that might mean India, Turkey, Eastern Europe. For American companies, that will mean Latin America. And, I'll tell you, years ago, you would go down to Bentonville, Arkansas, which is Walmart's headquarters. Walmart doesn't go to you. You have to fly in like you're going to see the Pope if you want to get their stuff
For sure.
on a superstore. And if you went in to meet with a Walmart buyer 15 years ago, they would ask you, where are you making this product you would like us to put on our shelves? And if the answer was something other than China, they would lose interest. That had to mean you were paying more than the cheapest possible price. And now, if you go in there and the answer is, only China, the conversation's over. Talking about how McKinsey took this sensible idea from Toyota that you only make as much stuff as you need to replenish what you sold, and they turned it
Thus,
into
just
this
in time.
just in time, right? They turned it into this crude imperative to just cut inventory to the bone. And they said to executives, give it to yourself in extra comp as a reward for being smart enough to hire McKinsey. Give it to your shareholder through dividends, and they'll love you, and your share price will go up as a result. And there is this sense that that's been overdone. McKinsey will now say, "Oh no, we need just in case, not just in time. We actually need more inventory." But every time there's been a similar shock in the past, like after Fukushima in Japan in 2012, where there were shortages, we've gone back to the way it was for the simple reason that the corporate executive who proposes spending more money to build an extra factory somewhere as a hedge or build up inventory is essentially saying, let's dilute the earnings. And the corporate CEO who says, let's just keep doing it the way we've been doing it because it's just been awesome. Well, when inevitably there is a shock that will shut this thing down again, that guy's probably on a beach in a hammock holding a cocktail somewhere. And the CEO who proposed spending more money sensibly as a hedge against trouble has probably long lost their job. Those incentives are still in place, and the incentives are what matters.
Finally, one thing we didn't talk about yet is India, and you just mentioned it. Do all roads for the United States go through India in addition to Latin America as we pull back a little bit from China?
That's an open question. So that's what I'm puzzling over for a bunch of stories that haven't run yet. I think some stuff goes to India. India is an interesting situation because India totally missed out on the manufacturing boom that lifted much of East Asia, Southeast Asia. They've only got 13% of their GDP in manufacturing compared to like 28% in China. That's poor. In fact, that's actually down since Narendra Modi took office, supposedly this great business-friendly leader. There is a moment. India is having a moment. Walmart's looking, Target's looking, IKEA's looking. There's a lot of activity in India as multinationals look at India as an alternative to China. And at least on paper, it's the one place on earth that's got the scale to eventually produce a supply chain that could be largely separate from China. Now it's heavily dependent upon, things like chemicals, basic materials for its pharmaceutical industry that come in from China. But, it's got 1.4 billion people. It's got a lot of raw materials. So multinational companies are interested in that potential. But I was struck by the fact as I looked back that there's been a moment almost every decade, going back a half a century, where somebody showed up and said, this is India's moment. Now India emerges as the great powerhouse. And there are reasons to doubt the story. The bureaucracy has been streamlined, but it's still pretty significant. Skills are very uneven. I mean, one of the things that people skip over because they're so busy telling a story about China, being this nefarious power, is giving China its due for investing heavily in primary healthcare and education, which allowed migrant workers to stream from rural areas to cities to take factory jobs. In India, you just don't have the same level of skills. You don't have the infrastructure, although it's starting to be built. So I think the potential is real, but there are reasons to doubt that it'll happen.
Well, Peter, we will look forward to that reporting in the pages of the New York Times. For our listeners, the book is How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Go get a copy. This is the book that you all need to read this summer. Peter, thank you so much for being with us today and all this great insight.
Oh, thanks so much. This was a great conversation.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.